What's up YouTube? So today I want to show you my most updated method for making Psytrance bass lines using Serum 2. So I'm going to structure this video as a kind of like basic, intermediate, advanced kind of thing. We're going to get the basic sound going and setup process going. Then I want to talk about how to create the sound of like a final post-processed bass sound just inside Serum. And then I want to show you some really cool tricks that kind of nip things in the bud. So in previous videos about bass, I've talked about all sorts of things about fundamental removal, side chaining, creating the waveform outside of the plugin itself. But this video is going to hopefully kind of encompass all of that processing, everything directly inside Serum. And so, yeah, I'm going to have to kind of do it basic, intermediate, advanced, but you'll see why. Also, because if you're not really too interested in the more advanced stuff and you just want to get a sound going, you can kind of watch the first 10 minutes or whatever, and you should be good. Anyway, blabbering out the way, let's dive in and have a look. So I firstly just want to talk about a little bit of setup stuff. Usually what I do when I'm making, when I'm producing tracks is I will use a note transpose, just because what this does is this basically allows me to write in C. So for example, we'll put in a bunch of C notes here. The Psytrance bass pattern is usually something like this. And then using the transpose, we can now change it into a different key. So say, for example, we want the track to be an F. We can just set it here. And this is really handy because in the beginning stages of the track, sometimes it might change. Sometimes you're not sure what key you want to work with. And then being able to just change this one up or one down, rather than having to go in and edit all the MIDIs, it's a real time saver. It's also cool because now I already know what notes kind of work well with C, so I can kind of do these melodic bass lines pretty quickly. Do you know what I mean? Maybe we need to go an octave down. Anyway, so I'm not going to talk about too much of the MIDI stuff in this video. I've done a couple of videos in the past with really cool techniques for writing MIDI stuff, so you can kind of pick that up from those videos if you want. I will post links in the description. Let's dive into Serum and actually create the basics for the sound, right? So first things first, what I want to do is I want to turn the phase randomization of the oscillator off or to 0. And so now every time the note is triggered, it's going to be identical. Here, if this is on 100%, you can kind of hear the notes aren't exactly the same. At 0, you notice that the notes are the same. So Serum's voice stealing, this is a bit of an advanced concept, but Serum's voice stealing is really good. So in previous videos with other VSTs, I've showed a technique where you kind of have to mute the oscillator so that they sound the same every time. So you use like an envelope to mute the oscillator, or you can just make the note itself shorter. Does that make sense? So that the release tail has enough time. But in Serum, I've found that that's not as much of an issue because the voice stealing, that concept is called voice stealing, is just super clean. So if you've seen that kind of technique in a previous video with Vital or Phase Plant or something like that, you don't necessarily have to employ that technique here. So let's get the filter going. Let's set up filter 1. By default, Serum's filter's resonance is 10%, but we want to actually turn that down to 0. And I usually like working with MG low 18 or low 18 or the 24s, but let's just stick with MG low 18 for now. And then what I'll do is I will set up an envelope onto that cutoff. And then also by default, Serum's attack is at 1 millisecond. We want to actually just zero that out as well on the envelopes. And then here, we actually want to turn the sustain down, turn the decay down. We can use this to kind of lock the interface. And we want to turn the sustain down so that we can kind of see when it hits the end of the note. And another cool thing about the interface here is that Serum will actually display these grid lines. So you can kind of see where the 16th note is, etc., which is pretty cool. So depending on the type of bass sound you want, if you want it a little bit more punchy, then you may go a bit lower on the sustain. If you wanted a bit more, like a bit more body in the bass sound, then you can kind of go a bit up on the sustain. But that's up to you. What I like to do is I like to create one envelope which kind of does a more gradual shape of the sound like this with the sustain and everything. And then another one, let's just zero out the attack, which is much quicker where the sustain goes all the way down. And with this one, we apply it to the cutoff as well. And let's actually just jump into the matrix and set it to unipolar, so it's only going upwards. And we can drag it down a little bit. And so with this one, we're actually just adding a little bit of extra bite to the transient of the sound. And then we can also fine tune this cutoff. Okay, what I like to do is on the main envelope, also just turn the sustain down a little bit. And that just helps to accentuate the transient of the sound. We can actually turn the decay down so it's at least within the range of when the note will be played. Do you hear that difference? Just these subtle changes can really make a big difference, because obviously, like, when the track is mixed and mastered, you're getting much less space to work. As you boost these things in the overall mix, there's less space to work with. So these kinds of subtle changes can really make a difference in the overall mix, right? Okay, cool. I'm happy with this as the basic template or setup. So what we could do is we could potentially save this as a preset. So the next technique that I want to talk about is dispersion. And in previous videos, I've showed various techniques of kind of getting this sound like outside of the plugin using kilohertz disperser, using various other plugins. But the kind of concept of the sound is it's supposed to emulate multi-band processing. I'm sure you've seen so many tutorials where people will say, oh, use this plugin, don't change any settings or anything, kind of leave it as default, because it just has that kind of crisp sound. You see it often with bass tutorials where I've seen stuff like Waves Vitamin is used quite a bit, where it's like kind of put on the bass and you don't change anything. And the sound that's actually being introduced is the sound of all pass filters, which are used in the process of making multiband filters, right? So there is a new filter introduced in Serum 2 called, I'm just going to jump to filter 2 here. I have actually showed this in a previous video, but I didn't kind of go into the finer details of how I use this for bass sounds. Diffuser. So diffuser is essentially that sound, and the stages is the amount of multiband splits that you're introducing. So let's just say, for example, like 7 or 5 or 6 stages is the amount of multiband splits. So if you have 2 processes that you're adding, like 2 plugins, one is a 3-band split and the other is a 3-band split, then in total you have 6 filter stages, right? So the trick here is to apply this sound to the actual waveform, not just kind of run the wave through it. Because it's a filter, it has a sort of wobbly effect. We don't want too much of that kind of effect. You know, imagine like a reverb on a bass or something. We don't want to post-process it, but we want the sound of the post-processing inherent in the waveform. And how we can do that is using Serum's internal resample system. So what I want to do is I'm going to set up this filter how I like the sound. So let's just turn off filter 1. Let's just see what's happening here. Let's enable MIDI. Okay, so now the saw wave is going through this diffuser filter. Oh, no, wait, we have to enable it here. So now the saw wave is going through the diffuser filter. So I've kind of settled on the settings of around like between 400 and 500 So let's just say like 472, a little bit of drive, and a stages of about 15%. And then a resonance of about 18% or so. So let's just bypass. And you'll notice here there's actually something interesting that happens with the diffuser. The volume, like the loudness, kind of sounds very similar, but it peaks at a different value. And this is something I think inherent to dispersion, where each harmonic is kind of offset a little bit in phase, so it evens out the overall amplitude of a waveform. And you can kind of use this to make a bass sound louder but peak slightly lower. So it's a really interesting effect for getting more loudness as well. But anyway, so here it does sound a little bit louder, but not that much that we're seeing, not as much as we're seeing on the meter, right? Let's go menu and then resample to oscillator B. Another thing that we actually want to do is we want to set this key track on so that the note is specific to the key. So when I actually resample without key track, you'll see it kind of looks just like an upward ramp with that wobble. But with key track, you'll see it gives you that more traditional dispersed saw wave effect. Okay, so once we've resampled, because of the envelopes and stuff, you'll notice the first frame is sometimes like not very loud. And then because we've left it static, we haven't actually modulated it. It's just a static waveform. So we can actually just go in here, find a loud-ish one, and then just say remove all except selected. And then we're just left with a single cycle waveform. And then here we can say single normalize, and then we get it nice and loud. So here what we're going to want to do now is let's turn off filter 2, turn on filter 1, and now we can set up this oscillator through that original setup that we had. So let's say oscillator B through filter 1. And we can actually go like this, and then we can turn these on. We can switch between them to compare, which is pretty cool. We want to make sure here as well that we actually set random to 0 and turn the phase all the way to the beginning of the cycle, so we get that little click at the beginning of the cycle. That's very important. Okay, so let's also just go into filter 2 and turn this off, because when we mute a filter, the inputs will still be passed through dry. So if you don't want to hear the dry alongside the filter, you want to turn that off. And so that's also important in the resample process, if I didn't explain that already. So here we can actually just A-B between them. Do you hear that? It's basically the same set of frequencies, but it just sounds so much tighter. The traditional saw wave just sounds a little bit flabby. It's lacking a little bit in the transient. But also, we've got that boost of headroom now, so we can boost the volume a little bit in the sound without peaking it out. Okay, so that's how to get the sound of post-processed bass sound directly out of the waveform. We're not even using any effects inside Serum here, which is pretty cool. It's all in the waveform. We could potentially go in and draw this, but I find to go here and actually punch in these exact values here and to kind of fine-tune it to the sound and resample it, you're getting a little bit more, when you're just drawing the waveform, I guess you're more just shooting in the dark, whereas here, the outcome is more deterministic, if you know what I mean. Okay, so let me discuss the last concept that I want to talk about today. Here we can actually save this as base template 1, dispersed. So the last concept that I want to talk about today is removing the fundamental. So let's just open up I'm going to use mini meters. but any spectrograph should do for this test, right? So what I'm going to do is just going to show you what the bass looks like without any filtering. In fact, we can turn these off like this. Do you see that orange line at the bottom there? That's the fundamental frequency. It's essentially just the sub in your sound. So the best way of sort of handling this kind of thing would be to duplicate the frame, right? And then in this one, we simply just remove the fundamental. And so here we have the sound. It sounds exactly the same. However, there's no subtone. And then when we move the wavetable position above that halfway mark, we get sub. So we're going to want to interpolate that because there's that click when it moves over. So here we go to morph, and we want to set this to crossfade, not spectral, because the spectral would actually change the shape. And now we have that kind of smooth interpolation between a sound, which is, you know, it sounds full, but it just doesn't have any subtone, and then the full sound itself. And so we can actually go back and do this exact thing with the saw wave over here. What we're going to want to do here, though, is, again, remove all except selected, and then we can actually just duplicate and then do the same thing. Did you see that shape here? With the dispersed saw wave, the shape here was basically the same. The major difference was the phase of the bins, like I was explaining. So if we just remove this fundamental, we can now. We also want to set this morph to crossfade. Morph crossfade. And so now we have the choice. If we want that dispersed sound or the non-dispersed sound, if we want with a sub, without a sub. And so the with and without sub thing is important for, in my opinion, for side chaining, because I don't like to apply too much hefty side chain onto the overall signal, because you kind of get too much of a pumping effect. I like the first of those three bass notes to be still very present, but if you don't remove the low fundamental, it often clashes with the tail end of a kick drum. And then a lot of people will end up like phase shifting the bass and the kicks so that they fit perfectly. But if you just remove the fundamental of that first bass note, it often just oversteps that whole process of having to phase align the two elements, because the two subwaves don't actually exist at the same time. So if we set something like velocity onto the wavetable position, let's actually just go ahead and do it onto this one as well. We can close this this window for now. Set velocity to this wavetable position as well. Now, when we actually write the notes, the first of the three notes, we can make low velocity, and then these ones we make full velocity. And now what's going to happen, I should have actually left millimeters open, is that, we need to set oscillator B to actually go through the filter 1 again. That sounds good. And the first note has no fundamental tone or no sub that's going to interact with the kick in any way. Do you see that? It's just two little orange lines there. Let's also just compare the peak of these two. So let's go oscillator A now. We also want to set this minus 13.2. Let's try get this one to the same. Okay, with these, what I'll usually do is set this phase just a little bit before the up ramp, so we get that click sound as well. But still, it's like worlds apart in the kind of tonal quality, right? Now we can play around with like a different filter maybe to see what these different filters sound like. The low 18 is maybe a little bit brighter than the MG 18. I feel like the 24s often scoop in a bit too quick, you know what I mean? And 18 is a kind of nice middle ground between the 12 and the 24. Cool. Okay, that's about it. That explains pretty much everything that I wanted to get through in this video. And I hope you guys enjoyed that. I'm going to be uploading these presets to my Patreon for all my $5 supporters. So if you want to know what that's all about, check out the link in the description. I've also got tons of preset packs for this kind of music and others. Yeah, that's available on my store. I'm going to post links to that in the description as well. Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you haven't yet, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.